Hello, everyone. This is Joe Brewer here again for another great webinar for the learning journey, Living into the Design Pathway. And I am really feeling good that we get to talk about what it means to be a pro-social group today. And I'm also very excited, as you can see in the chat box over there, that Kathy is here in Barichara. She arrived earlier this week and is starting to volunteer. So you can ask her how does it feel to be in Barichara? What's it like to pull grass in the bioparque beside me as we're jabbering on, having conversations. And yeah, I'm just glad all of you are here as well. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that I consider to be of fundamental importance for the work that we're doing, and something that is so important that we incorporate it into every part of the work we do at Earth Regenerators. And so what we're going to be doing today is talking about a framework called Prosocial, and also what it means in general to be pro-social, or to be someone who supports the creation of socially healthy and engaging environments. And this is something we want to be able to do in the learning journey itself, but also, very importantly, in our efforts to make life changes in all of the things that come in the coming days, months, years, as we navigate all of the turbulence of the world. And what I'd like to do today, just for fun, is I have a very little poll here I'd love for you all to answer. So just let me know. Are you feeling pro-social today? And you can say yes, or you can say oh, no. You can say I'm not really sure what that means. And for those of you who aren't feeling pro-social today, and if you're comfortable sharing, you could drop something in the chat box and say that maybe you're just having a bad day, in a bit of a funk, you're a little confused and lost, or if you don't want to say anything, you can also remain anonymous. But what I think is going to be really powerful for us is to discover what it feels like to be in a pro-social group through our community Zoom calls, which have already been happening. And when I participate in those calls, I really feel it. I feel like we're alive and vibrant and engaged. People are generous and genuinely listening, cooperating, and being thoughtful and kind about, taking turns and about moving towards shared goals and other such things. So anyway, thank you for humoring me with this little poll that we have today. And what I would like to offer is that what we're going to talk about today has a sort of theoretical or academic component, which is to say that it's well researched and well supported by lots of evidence and different kinds of studies. But more importantly, it's extremely useful. It's something we can use in our daily lives to address just about any conflict or issue that may come up. And I see Dan has said in the chat box that he's having a challenging day. So Dan, I'm sorry to hear that you're having a rough day. And maybe we can help you feel better during the session today. So we'll do our best to create a nurturing pro-social environment for those among us who are having a hard time. Now, just to remind us of the basic layout of these webinars, during the roughly half an hour presentation that I'll begin in just a moment, you can ask a question, and you can vote for questions you'd like to have answered. You guys know the routine. And then we will use those questions, using the ones that got the most votes first, and then going down the line to have a discussion for the second half hour of our time today. And we'll go for about an hour. And also, just as a reminder, we have 3 community Zoom calls, one of them at 6 p.m. tomorrow, another at 11:30 a.m. on Monday, and a third one at 3 p.m. on Monday. And all of those are Central Time Zone, USA. So after today, we'll be able to roll right into conversations with each other using this conversation, this webinar as a prompt to kick us off. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump in and get started. And let's start talking about what it means to be in a pro-social group. So to begin, I open my presentation. Here it is. So today we're going to be learning about pro-social groups. And it's really important to keep in mind that social behavior is not limited to human beings. It's also something that lots of other animals, and even if you define social in broad ways, lots of plants and fungi also can be quite social in the ways they interact with each other. And some of them, like these leafcutter ants in this photograph, are very good at cooperating and very good at achieving common goals. And so we're going to be talking about pro-social groups in a way that actually applies to all of life, but it's particularly useful to understand how humans do it so that we can create effective groups ourselves. So let's remember a little bit of bigger context. Why do we need to have these pro-social groups? Well, pull out your handy little planetary boundaries framework from the Stockholm Resilience Center, and you'll see that if we cross even one of these 9 planetary processes, the entire global system collapses. And we've already crossed 4. So we need to have very good ways of cooperating with each other to bring all 4 of these planetary boundaries back within safe operating space, which is we need to stop biodiversity loss and the extinction of species. We need to change the land system change practices that are destroying ecosystems. We need to get off of industrial agriculture and stop using phosphorus and nitrogen that are killing our rivers and many of our oceans and coastal estuaries. And of course, we need to address the various aspects of planetary, regional, and local climate change. Jessica and Stefan, could you guys be a little bit quieter, please? I'm giving a webinar here. You guys are being really loud over there. Jessica, you guys are being really loud over there. Could you please be a little quieter? Thank you. So what we're going to be looking at here is how can we do this in small scales like local groups, but also how do we scale this all the way up to the entire planet, which is going to be extremely challenging, as you might imagine. And so basically to understand the context of what we need to do to address these planetary boundaries is we need to recreate the conditions for living locally in terms of the material flows, the integrated life systems, and the thriving of families and communities all over the planet. And this means in each local place with its particular type of culture and ecology, its particular type of climate and geology and geography, that we need to have contextually appropriate ways of regenerating landscapes. And we need to cooperate to do this. So if we're going to create this network of regenerative bioregions, these local living economies, this is going to require a huge amount of cooperation. So let's talk about how does cooperation occur in pro-social groups. First of all, there's this very provocative idea that the root cause of our problems might be something called behavioral flexibility, which is that humans are so good at creating cultural innovations to change the way that we grow food, create and use technology, build shelters and housing, use energy, create systems of transport. We're very flexible in the different kinds of behaviors we can engage in, and we've been able to engage in some incredibly destructive behaviors in the ways that our economies and our cultural practices affect the rest of the natural world. But what's powerful about this is that if we understand that it is the flexibility of our behavioral repertoire, meaning humans have a wide range of ways we could behave at any given moment, that actually we can turn this around and say, if we choose among the repertoire of behaviors that we have available to us, then we can actually get at the root cause of our ecological crisis and begin to make changes. And one very large domain of behavioral change that we need to do is we need to figure out how to get from what causes polarization, conflict, fragmentation, different groups of people being at odds with each other and having conflict, and guide the evolution of cultures using intentional practices so that we can create the conditions for cooperation to achieve shared goals. And this is sometimes called collective impact. How do we go from achieving individual impacts that undermine the collective to achieving collective impacts that also support the individuals? And this is something that's very much doable. Thank you. Oh, speaking of pro-social behaviors, Stefan just brought me a little treat that I'm going to eat while I'm presenting. Thank you, Stefan. That's delicious. In case you're wondering, this is what cheesecake looks like in Colombia. It's like a spongy cheese bread. Anyway, let's continue. What we really want to do is figure out how do we create these conditions for cooperation. where people really do want to work together toward common goals. Turns out humans are actually really good at this, because the argument can be made that one of the most distinctive things about humans as compared to other primates or other mammals is the specific ways that we engage in teamwork. We can use shared conceptual spaces and language and different ways of communicating with our voices, with gesturing in our bodies, and with technology to enable us to have shared understandings, shared purposes, shared actions, coordination, and move towards shared goals. And so this ability to engage in teamwork is incredibly adaptive for solving complex problems. And humans thrive in this, and we're really good at it. So the question is, how do we create the conditions for good teamwork? And this is where we introduce the idea of prosocial. And I recommend, if you're enjoying what I'm about to talk about, that you go to prosocial.world, where you can actually sign up and get trained and certified as a prosocial facilitator. I've gone through this prosocial training, as have several members of this learning journey, and quite a few people who host activities in the Earth Regenerators community. And prosocial is something like an integration or a transdisciplinary synthesis, where they move across different domains of knowledge, different disciplinary practices in the academic and research worlds, and they integrate them to create a coherent, consistent, and robust understanding. There are three key areas that prosocial is built upon, which I'm calling the foundational pillars. And we're going to go through these quickly today. So the first of them is that there's a set of core design principles for managing a commons. And we've talked before about what a commons is. What we'll do today is go into these core design principles and start talking about them in more detail to see that if you use them as a diagnostic or a prescriptive tool, you can actually intentionally evolve a group to more effectively manage its commons. And there's also an integration of the cognitive and behavioral sciences, as well as the ecological sciences, into what is known as contextual behavioral science, which is how we can understand the role of psychology, motivation, human behavior in the context of human social groups. And then more generally, there's a huge body of research in the evolution of cooperation in human and non-human species that we can bring to bear on these things to see what is universal and what is specific as we work toward intentionally guiding the evolution of our own groups. And let's start going one by one through these. Let's look at these core design principles for managing the commons. This is research that was developed by a woman named Elinor Ostrom, who is a political scientist, and she passed away in 2010. But this was just after being the first woman in history to get the Nobel Prize in Economics, which she won in 2009 for this work. And she spent decades, more than 40 years, studying different human groups in real-world settings where they had common pooled assets like shared pasture land, shared rivers for fisheries, and other such things, shared forest for collecting things from the forest. And she looked at what happens when people manage these common pooled assets. And what she found was it works when there are 8 core design principles that are being met. And the first of those, notice it's all 8 of them. The first of these, the first core design principle, is that the group of people needs to have a shared identity and purpose. So just like the rowers in this boat, they need to all be in the same boat. They need to be able to identify who's in the boat and who's not. And they need to know what is the purpose of all of us together in this boat. We might be rowing across a river or rowing across the finish line, and those are different purposes. But also, like these leafcutter ants here on the right, they might just be trying to reach a food source that they can't reach on their own, but by climbing and building a bridge with their bodies, they're able to work together, and all of the participants making this structure are a part of the group that's achieving the goal of acquiring food. So you see that in all cases, the group is functioning well if the group knows who is in the group and who's not, and they know what the group is for and why they're there. Now, what I'd like you to notice as I go through these core design principles is if you've ever been in a group that didn't work very well, might it possibly be because this core design principle wasn't being met? Because here you can see you might have been in a group that didn't know who's in and who's not, or didn't really know what the group was all about, and that can create a lot of problems. The second core design principle is the equitable share of contributions and benefits. What that basically means is that people who do more work get more benefit. Those who do less work get less benefit. And not only is this not always equal, it's usually not equal, because usually there's a smaller number of people who do more work. There are a lot of people who do some work, and there are a few people, free riders, who don't do any work but try to take the benefits for themselves. And what you'll find is the conflicts that arise, the feelings of injustice and unfairness between those doing more and those doing less can undermine the effectiveness of the group. Whereas if there's really clear, coherent, and fair sharing of contributions based on how people, benefits based on how people contribute, then the group is going to function much better. Core design principle number 3 is that when decisions are made, they're made in a way that the members of the group feel to be fair and inclusive. Now here I'm showing a picture of the Iroquois Nation to remind us that many indigenous cultures around the world engaged in governance practices that were indeed fair and inclusive, meaning that the way that representation occurred was based on people's responsibilities and their contributions to the group. And those who were recognized as leaders did not get themselves elected through power to become leaders. They were just recognized as trustworthy people, and they were respected and dignified by other people in the community who knew that they do a lot and have a lot to offer. So those who are highly competent and those who are very generous and those who are able to give a lot become respected leaders in this kind of a community. So one thing you can notice is it's not just about decision making, but also about the social values and norms about how we recognize who is a valid decision maker. And so all of these are parts of this core design principle number 3. And you've probably been in situations where decisions were made in a top-down way and you didn't feel they were fair, or you might have been in a process where it was very inclusive and you felt empowered to participate. The fourth core design principle is that if a group has common goals and they know who are members of the group, they also need to be able to recognize what kinds of behaviors move toward our goals and what kinds of behaviors get in the way of our goals. And then this means they need to be able to see how are people behaving. And a nice example of this is if you go into an elementary school classroom and see on the wall something like our class rules, you'll see that all of the students in the class, including the teacher, everyone in the class will know what the rules are. And they can all see them together and they can look around the room and say, oh, this person is following the rules and this person isn't following the rules. But maybe even better, if you have rules that are made through a fair and inclusive process, is that you might actually have the participants of the group create their own rules. A really powerful way of doing this is an activity called See, Hear, Feel, Do, which is based in a process of appreciative inquiry, which is you inquire into what do we appreciate about being here and what would we like to have more of? And so you can say, what would we like to see more of, which is visible behaviors of others. We might see people sharing with each other, see people looking happy, see people really focused in doing their work, looking at their behaviors. What do we hear that we'd like to have more of? We might hear laughing. We might hear jovial or happy conversation. We might hear people talking in a bubbling way that shows they're really engaged. What do we want to feel more of? Maybe we want to feel excited, engaged, satisfied, content, included, safe. They could be different things for different groups. And then what do we want to do more of, which is about what is the focus of what we're actually here for? Do we want to be mostly doing our work or mostly socializing? Should it be something else? It really depends on the purpose of the group. So you see that if we know what these are and all the participants create these lists together, then they can monitor the behaviors they agreed upon by just watching and helping each other to do them more. Then there's core design principle number 5. This one is very important and a little more subtle. What this says is that if someone is engaging in helpful behaviors and you want to reinforce that and get them to do more, then you give them little nudges of approval for small contributions. And you give them bigger benefits or bigger rewards or bigger nudges of approval for more helpful things. But also, if they're engaging in unhelpful or destructive things, then you might have to have ways of basically giving them negative consequences to tell them to stop doing that. A classic example of this is in the book Moral Origins by Christopher Boehm, when he gathered all the ethnographic research he could find from different hunter-gatherer societies. And he asked, what happens when people engage in bad behaviors? Because these hunter-gatherer societies tend to be very egalitarian. How do they pull that off? How do they keep someone who's selfish and egotistical from rising to power? And what he found was there was graduated responses. Basically, if someone does some small negative thing, like taking more than their share during a hunt, there might be some way of gossiping about that good and bad behavior during story time as they all sit around the fire. But if the bad behavior continues, or if it's something more severe, then that person may be kicked out of the group temporarily or permanently banished. You're not allowed to be here because you're not a good member of the group. And in extreme cases, when someone's destructive and consistently harmful to the group, he observed, even though it was rare, that they would engage in capital punishment, which means that some members of the group would actually kill another member of the group, which might happen if there was a violent serial killer that happened to be in their community. So like I said, that's extremely rare, but you can see by these examples that you have graduated responses, small responses initially, and then they grow bigger until eventually there are stronger consequences. What this does is it allows people to change their own behavior, gives them additional chances, but also protects the group from extremely harmful behaviors by having various levels of response. It creates a kind of innovation and adaptation for how the group manages conflicts. Core design principle number 6 is about having fast and fair conflict resolution, because conflicts, they always arise, they're going to happen. And so the question becomes, how are they managed? And it turns out how quickly they're addressed. Are they allowed to fester, or do they get addressed promptly? And do all the people involved in the conflict feel like the process of resolving the conflict was done fairly? If they don't, this could create resentment or could create factions and break the group apart. Core design principle number 7 says that if the group has a purpose, the group also needs to be empowered to take actions in service to that purpose. They need authority to govern themselves. So if you have a group that's in the Hudson Valley in upstate New York, but the city of New York as a municipality, which is located somewhere else, can make decisions about how the Hudson Valley is managed, then what that means is the jurisdictions, the domain of decision-making authority, are not in alignment with what is needed by each group. And a really powerful way to see self-governance is to look like something like this marmor of starlings, which is this black flowing blob in the air in the upper right. This is a photograph of thousands of starling birds flying together where they each contribute through their local interactions. They make decisions about where the entire flock goes. And what's interesting is the entire population of starlings decide together where they should all go through their interactions. And governance is self-organized and is at the scale of the entire population. And this has a correlation with democracy and local governance and local decision-making, where those who need to make decisions, like those who are managing a particular fishery, need to be able to make those decisions without some other institution getting in their way. And this leads to core design principle number 8, which is that all of those previous 7 principles that apply within the group, they also apply to how that group interacts with other groups. An example of this is the 5 nations of the Iroquois as they were measured in the year 1650. And so here what you can see is the Iroquois nation is actually a group of groups who all agree to the same ways of governing at the federation level. And that's how they're able to manage decisions that go up and down in scale, down to the more local and up to the more universal. And this flexibility of moving up and down in scale is what Elinor Ostrom called polycentric governance. Polycentric meaning multiple centers or multiple points of focus. What's important for our purposes is that a group might be very prosocial and really manage its commons well, but if it has to interact with another group that doesn't, they can have all kinds of problems. And this is going to be a challenge for us when we go back to a question Marcus had asked in the first webinar: how do we scale up from the local to the larger scale? And this polycentric governance gives us some insights into how that may or may not work. So those were the core design principles for managing the commons, but there's also this field of contextual behavioral science. And what's interesting about contextual behavioral science is you look at the behaviors of the person or of the group in the context that they're in. So it's like an ecological perspective on behavior. And this is really important for us to say the context is the group as well as the setting the group operates in. And the behaviors are understood relative to that group and its context. And what we want to do is apply insights about the study of therapeutic change and training practices that help people be successful at guiding their own social change as they come to know the context that they're in. What's really important for us to understand is that human behavior can be seen as an evolutionary process. There's this great quote by B.F. Skinner, who's the founder of behaviorism, when he said, "We have seen that in certain respects, operant reinforcement, which is basically the stimulus that reinforces the behavior of an animal or organism, that in certain respects, this operant reinforcement resembles the natural selection of evolutionary theory. Just as genetic characteristics, which arise as mutations, are selected or discarded by their consequences, meaning how well suited are they to their environment. If they're poorly suited to their environment, they go away. If they're well suited to their environment, they tend to propagate and spread." He said, "So too do novel forms of behavior get selected or discarded through reinforcement." An example of this that's somewhat insidious, but really makes the point, is if you look at the marketing of cigarettes to teenagers and children, the way that Camel cigarettes did, where they used a cartoon character to appeal to young people, that this actually helped young people to think it's cool to smoke and got them to smoke, which of course led to all kinds of health problems later in their lives. But there was a very strong selective reinforcement, which is the tobacco companies made a huge amount of money. And as long as they were able to manipulate young people with marketing, they would keep doing this. So marketing to manipulate behavior, to reinforce an outcome, is an example of an evolutionary process selecting for young people to start smoking and to get them to keep smoking across their lifetimes. The thing is that the selection of one behavior or another is in the context of, in this case, media institutions, messages, stories, the identities and aspirations of the people involved. Here it's the young people who might want to look attractive or to be cool or other things like this, the social norms of the environment they're in, but that the behaviors are actually selected for how best they thrive or what is most well suited to the particular environment. And it turns out an environment where marketing is not regulated and tobacco companies can market to children is highly susceptible to manipulation to get those young people to start smoking and to make a lot of money off of making them sick, which is exactly what happened with the tobacco industry. And then later, exactly the same marketing companies were hired to spread lies about climate change, which has had its own effective consequences for the fossil fuel industry. So, if evolutionary processes can explain or help us understand that the fitness of the behavior to its context will tell us which behaviors spread, we can also look inside the person and see the ecological context of that person's psychology. And it turns out that there's a really powerful finding in psychological research for how a person makes positive changes in their own life. And it's in something called a relational frame, which is a conceptual model that a person has for how they relate one part of themselves to another. And it's been discovered through various kinds of research that the most important relational frame for behavioral change is how the person in the present moment relates their present behaviors to their aspirations of their future self. For example, if it's Friday night and I could go party with my friends, but on Monday morning I have an exam, how do I feel about my future self on Monday morning as I choose whether to stay home and study or to go out and party? It turns out this relationship of present self to future self is really important. And the foundations for managing this and making these kinds of decisions come about in the regulation of emotions. Like, can I manage the impulse that says, oh, it sounds like so much fun to hang out with my friends? And do I have the psychological flexibility to imagine different futures and then make decisions in the present based on the future that I want? Can I be flexible in looking at different options and managing my emotions to make decisions about the future that are aligned with my goals? And it turns out that this is the domain where life either is successful or it fails, depending on how well people do this. So what we want to think about in prosocial groups is how can we cultivate the relationship of a member of the group or the identity of the group as a whole from its present capacities to its future capacities, and can the members of the group move the group toward those future goals? So for us in this learning journey, for example, all of us want to live more regeneratively. Can we as a group provide the supports that help us all to become more regenerative in our behaviors and in our way of being? Would be a measure that we were successful in some way. And so this is a way to relate what I'm talking about to the learning journey. A very powerful tool for doing this, which I included as an online activity, is there's a video you can watch if you haven't seen it yet on the course page on the Earth Regenerators platform for this thing called the ACT matrix. ACT stands for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy or Acceptance and Commitment Training. And it's a really powerful tool that lets you notice your mental experience or your inner behavior of what you feel and how you are, and your outer or visible, your observable behaviors, the actions you take in the world. And you can move toward things that you most want to be, and you can move away from things you'd like to have less of. What's powerful about this matrix is it's a thinking tool that allows you to practice building a regulation of emotions and psychological flexibility. Here's an example of how it works. If you imagine these 4 quadrants of the ACT matrix, numbered here 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I asked you to think, who is someone you want to be like? Who is someone you aspire to be like? Someone that you really look at them and you admire them. Well, in quadrant 2, you could write down a list of things like, what do you see them doing? You might see them being courageous. You might see them being consistent. You might see them acting on things that they care about. In quadrant 4, for the inner world, which values or feelings are expressed or embodied by these behaviors? So if you see someone who's really persistent in their work, does that mean that they value being devoted, or they value living out their values, or they feel really committed? You see, in the bottom quadrant, you write down the felt experience of the way you'd like things to be. And then if you thought of someone you don't want to be like, someone who engages in behaviors that you feel are deplorable or are unnice, things you don't want to see or you'd want to have less of. And in quadrant 1, you could say, you might see this person being lazy. You might see them being dishonest where they say they do something, but they don't follow through. You might see them doing it sometimes, but not being consistent. You'd write all those down in quadrant 1. And then in quadrant 3, which is things you would want to move away from, but are in the realm of feelings and values, you say, well, when the person's engaging in these behaviors, how do they feel? They might feel unmotivated. They might feel shame. They might feel angry at themselves and other such things. And as you write these down, they allow you to start to reflect on them and then begin to notice when you behave like someone you want to be like and when you behave like someone you don't. And as you practice using this ACT matrix, you become better at doing more of what you want to be like and less of what you don't want to be like. And over time, this is like natural selection. You select for the behaviors and feelings you want more of, and you select against the behaviors and feelings that you want less of. And over time, you become more like the person you want to be. What's interesting is while this can be done at the individual level, you can also take it up to the group level, which means if you have a group, like a work group, for example, or all the participants in this learning journey, each of us individually might fill out this matrix and have our own personal responses. But then we might each also fill out the same matrix, writing a list of responses for how we think the group should be. What is a group that I really aspire to be like, and what are some of the ways that they behave? Which was an activity that I gave us last week to think about supportive social behaviors that we'd like to see more of. And then what are some feelings and values that we really would like to see in that group? Similarly, what is another group or other groups that we experience that we'd like to be less like? How did they behave? What kinds of actions happened? And what feelings and values were present there? And you see that you can use the group matrix by just doing the same matrix, asking the questions about your group. And what happens here that's very powerful is when you look at your personal responses for you as an individual, you can find alignment or you can find dissonance and conflict between yourself and the group. And if the group has a really clear identity and purpose, and you as an individual really feel your resonance with that shared identity and purpose, then you're going to be much more engaged to participate and have a clearer understanding of how to participate. So it goes back and forth, up and down these two levels. What's really interesting about this is that if we combine this group matrix and personal matrix with Elinor Ostrom's core design principles, then we actually improve our emotion regulation and our psychological flexibility. And we improve our skills at managing our personal behaviors and group behaviors as we change what we're doing. Then we can actually do all of this in service to a commons, which is the group and its purpose. So if our purpose is to regenerate the earth, and our group is about learning how to change our lives to help regenerate the earth, then we can use Elinor Ostrom's principles to help this group function well. And we can participate in the group in a powerful, psychologically flourishing way by using things like the ACT matrix. And we become better and better by practicing using the ACT matrix as acceptance and commitment training. We train at accepting when we don't live up to our aspirations, and we commit to training more. And as we do that, we change our own behaviors, we improve the group behaviors, and we create new capacities in ourselves that become new capacities for the group. What's interesting about this is that this is a way of thinking about cultural scaffolding. Here we're talking about the development of individuals and the development of group processes. That as we map out how the group is working and how we are participating in the group using tools like the Ostrom core design principles or the ACT matrix, that we actually develop new capacities as individuals and as group. We are doing cultural scaffolding. It's really interesting to look at historic examples like what's talked about in a book called The Nordic Secret, which showed that the Scandinavian countries that created strong social democracies, they did this by focusing on something called bildung, which basically means human development across the lifespan or development of the character for the whole person. And there were folk high schools in Denmark, in Finland, and Sweden that actually helped, and in Norway, that helped them to develop individual people through different stages of psychological capacities. And there are really interesting ways of thinking about human capacities as they go up in levels. And what they found was that to have a working social democracy, the members of your society have to be able to participate in governing their own lives and governing their communities. So they have to gain the psychological capacities to do so. And this cultivation of human capacities within groups of various sizes is how they did it. And they did it with education using something called folk high schools. In our case, we could think of it conceptually like this. We want to culturally evolve human capacities, and we want to do it in a statistical way. Which is, if you have a group of people in an earlier time, and let's say that there are three categories, just so we can think about this conceptually. There's a group of people that just live out the stories of their culture. They adopt what the culture tells them about how they should behave. But there's another set of people who are able to change the story and say, I was born as a farmer, but I really want to be a teacher, so I'm going to make the changes myself, and I'm going to author my own story. But then there'll be even fewer people who develop the capacity to transform themselves, to break down and deconstruct their story, and to build a different one. And I would argue that everyone in this learning journey is either has this transformational capacity now or is trying to cultivate it. So let's imagine using these three different categories. There's an earlier time where 50% of the population, or half of the people, just live out the stories of their society. 30% are able to make their own stories and lead themselves in an entrepreneurial way. And 20% have a transformational capacity. Well, if we bring tools like Prosocial to this context and help more people move up the scales, then at a later time, it might only be 25% that adopts the culture, 50% that has the ability to change their story and take leadership in creating their own lives, and going from 20% to 25%, more people who are able to participate in transformation of self and change their lives in deep and profound ways and become exemplars and role models, teachers and guides for those who are going through the change process later in time. What we want to do by living into the design pathway is be these transformational capacities in our own communities and help others, meaning we are the cultural scaffolds for them, so that other people can get to where we're going behind us, coming along and learning from what we learned to do it better than we did. So this is a way of thinking about using prosocial to intentionally guide our cultural evolution. What's interesting about those two, see, I mentioned there are three, and I've only talked about two, and already we can see there's a lot of power here. This is really powerful stuff. If we understand how to create effective groups, recognizing that every group is a commons, and we manage them with Ostrom's core design principles, and we use insights from contextual behavioral science and tools like the ACT matrix to help us become better members of the group and have better self-knowledge and to better observe and participate in changing the dynamic patterns of our groups, then we can evolve the cooperation of our groups. And this is a place where I want to step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture and say that there's this very powerful history in the 3.6 billion years of life on Earth, where simple structures became more complex as cooperation evolved. Here, the simple structure is a simple bacteria, which is a prokaryotic cell. All that means is it does not have any complex organelles, doesn't have any complex structure in it. And down below, this one that says complex structure is a paramecium, which is also a single-celled organism, but it's about 1,000 times larger by volume than most bacteria. 1,000 times larger, because all of those organelles, all those structures inside, used to be independent bacteria, and they came inside of other bacteria and co-evolved until they became fully integrated, and they cooperated so much that they became an integrated new level of complex life. Eukaryotic cells, cells with organelles. But eventually these eukaryotic cells learned how to create multicellular organisms, including humans, where my body has somewhere around 37 trillion individual cells, each of which is complex like a paramecium. What's interesting to see here is structures arise where there's cooperation, integration occurs, modularity occurs, which means separate differentiated functions, and they integrate and interact with each other, and they become mutually dependent for their survival. And so this is the pathway of evolution for cooperation that creates increasing complexity. And the question for us is, how do we do this in groups? So when we cultivate trust, goodwill, passion, and engagement, meaning we've created prosocial groups, there's a thriving flow of interaction in those groups. It's very dynamic and alive, and it's much more complex and rich than the individual participants. So this might be a universe of interactions with individual stars, but it's the web of relationships is where really all of the creativity and the power are. And so prosocial groups do this well, and groups that aren't very prosocial do it less well. So we can think of it like this. What we're trying to do is create prosocial groups where each group is a commons. So you use Elinor Ostrom's principles to say, what is the commons? What is the shared identity and purpose? How do we manage and govern the commons, which is all of the other design principles? And then we say, all right, but the participants in this group need to have emotion regulation and psychological flexibility to build up their capacities to intentionally evolve and guide the commons that they're a part of. And as they do this, they give rise to the flourishing of prosocial feelings and behaviors. Feeling a lot of trust, being very generous, having a lot of passion, having a strong sense of purpose driving their behavior, and having it be a collective purpose. High levels of engagement and very altruistic, generous, group-serving behaviors. And as we do this, we become prosocial groups and we can move up the scales of complexity. So the idea is to create prosocial groups that are of various kinds. Thematic groups around different domains of inquiry or practices, like a prosocial group that gardens, or a prosocial group that does reforestation, or a prosocial group that works with grief and trauma. But you can also have prosocial groups based on geography, like in each bioregion around the world, create nested levels of prosocial groups that work as social ecosystems within those bioregional networks. That's the idea of what we're trying to do. So the question here is, how can you become an agent of prosocial evolution? Noticing I'm using the word agent, which means you have agency. How can you create? How can you help produce and support the rise of these prosocial evolutionary processes? Part of the answer is to form groups and have those groups become prosocial. But what else? What's coming to mind for you? What are you thinking of? And that's what I'd like to start to discuss now. So that's the presentation. And I'd love to start a conversation with you for the remaining time. And what I think is that this topic is one of the most important topics for us. It's one of those things that is really going to help us to learn how to participate in groups and get the supports that we need. So I see we have one question here in the Ask a Question box. If anyone has a question you'd like to have answered, go ahead and write it there. And I see the question, which is from Julian. So I'll invite Julian onto the screen. And Julian's saying, is there something to the number 8? 8 core design principles, Fullerton's 8 principles of regenerative economics, Joe's 8 proponents of living a regenerative life. What's going on with this number 8? And Julian, I hope the technology works for you to join me while we're discussing this. If anyone has other questions, drop them in there. Hey, Julian, it's great to see you. How are you?
Doing well. How are you doing?
Are you also struck by the eightfold path of Buddhism? Just to throw another one in the mix.
No, I was just observing the number 8 and throughout these different frameworks. And so I don't know if this is merely coincidence or this might be something to it, in the cosmic sense. So more of a fun question than a deep probing one, but thought I'd ask it.
I think it's a good question. And I think there's one very practical answer. Probably other answers as well, but one very practical one, which is an adult human with a functioning brain will have a working memory that can stay on the same task for up to 18 minutes, and that can hold in its active memory for the typical person, which means everyone in the group can do it, between 5 and 9 pieces of information. And usually it's between 5 and 7. And so what I think happened is these 8 principles are human conceptual frameworks that are teachable and learnable, where it's possible to remember the whole while going into the parts and come back to them. And I suspect that what falls out is the constraints of human cognition led to them being 8. And I suspect that's the case, but there might be other reasons as well. And I'm just curious what you think of that. If I use it as a provocation, I'm curious what you say.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty good one. I know there's 7. There's a reason why there's 7 digits to phone numbers. 7 and 8, roughly the same. I think Pamela put a fun link in the chat and alludes to some idea of 8 being a number of balance. I can sort of think about the cardinal points as well, which is 4, but then you have the in between, the intermediary points, right? So that's 8. I don't know. I just thought it was a fun recurring thing. Maybe the last sound of regenerate is 8. Maybe that's another thing.
In English, yeah.
But then maybe, I guess, maybe just one other thought, not related to this directly, but as you were talking about the 8 core design principles, I was thinking in my head, how are we as Earth Regenerators community, how are we doing on these 8 criteria? Because I think, at least to speak for myself, I hadn't necessarily thought about it that way. I mean, whenever we talk about prosocial, I've been thinking about how do we apply the core design principles in our lives, in our groups that we're working outside of Earth Regenerators, not realizing that, hey, we're building a group here too. And so attending this session today has just given me, has spurred me to think, okay, well, how can we apply these principles right here in this community? So just a thought, more than a question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah. Your question's actually a primary question because we will learn these core design principles by practicing them. And the place to practice them is in the groups you're in. And a key thing that you can do that's easier is to diagnose problems. Like maybe you and your family are having difficulties and you observe that you don't actually have a shared sense of purpose, or you observe that you don't have an inclusive way of making decisions. And so you can use the design principles as a diagnostic tool and say, we don't have a pro-social setting, so which of these core design principles is not being met? And then that gives you a way of knowing what to focus on to help you to work on things like, oh, we actually don't have my wife and I are not aligned about raising our children. We don't have shared purpose. So that means we need to have a conversation about what is the purpose of education in the way we're raising our children. And you discover a shared purpose, or you don't in that process, but at least you know that's something to focus on. And so I found as a diagnostic tool, it's extremely useful. And then also as an adaptive management tool, which is to say, we have this new challenge arising, and what have we been good at in the past that we could lean into as a strength? And where do we have deficiencies that a problem could come along to make us fragile? You know, there are various ways you can think of it in a forward-oriented way as well. But that's after you've gotten used to using them and have practiced them a bit. But yeah, it's a great question and something we'll definitely talk about more. So thanks for bringing that up. Thanks a lot, Julian. And I see a bunch of other questions are coming in, which is wonderful. So thank you for that. Let's see here, looking at voting. I see there's a question here by Jonathan and one by Mitty that both have one vote. So I'll start with the one from Jonathan. Jonathan, last time we had problems with the technology, we weren't able to invite you on the screen. So hopefully it works this time. But the question you asked is, we'd be interested in people who are willing to help us develop a training educational process for a community initiative that we expect to create. Okay, well, that's not really a question though. Jonathan, are you there? Can you hear me?
We're here. I don't know if you can hear us.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So it was actually Victoria's question or comment. Just go ahead.
Hi, Victoria.
Hi.
Hello.
So this education process, let's see, we hope to generate a group of people to steward what we'd like, the regenerative process that we think Rochester could enable as a model for how to use this particular tool, CPACE, which is a financing tool for clean energy projects, as a tool to kind of get into regenerative development as a community. This is a money-making thing, and it has many outcomes. Yeah.
Victoria, sorry to interrupt, but I think it's actually be a great topic to bring up, like by writing a post on the course page.
Sure.
And also something for the Regenerative Project Incubator. And so I'm just noticing that we don't have a lot of time. So that would be a better place where you could actually share the full idea and invite people to participate in it. And then also have an ongoing dialogue. And so would it be okay? Do you mind like writing up a post or even recording a short video and posting it there? Just in some way you feel good about sharing it with the community on the course page?
Oh, mostly I realize it's part of the culture that this question wasn't an appropriate place to have that conversation, but we're so excited about how this so dovetails with where we need to go. So I'm
awesome.
So grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. And please do bring it up in the group and let's see if we can recruit people to engage around it. That'd be beautiful. I see the next question here that's getting a lot of votes is from Mitty. Mitty, didn't you just have your birthday, if I remember correctly? I'm not sure. You'll tell me if you're able to come on the screen. She says, is there anybody else feeling that the prosocial model is both admirable and also has a deep design flaw in being based on a behaviorist and modern scientific mindset? One thing I'd say to this is that it absolutely does not have that flaw, because I only presented part of where it comes from. But we can definitely talk about this and say that the focus on the research that demonstrates how well it functions is a perspective to help learn it, but it's actually something that is accumulated from many cultural settings.
I'm not hearing you.
You're not able to hear me? Yeah, testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me?
I'm still not hearing you.
We're having a technical problem. But you were hearing me before. Well, I guess one thing you could try, do you have headphones? Maybe, yeah, try putting in the headphones. Is that working? Testing.
Joe, it
No.
must not be the right time to be asking this question because I'm not hearing you.
It's okay. Here's what I'll do.
But I'm pleased to see there were several people responding that they'd like to talk to it, because it does feel like something really important, because I feel it's coming out of a mindset which has itself some question marks, as having been part of how we've got ourselves into the mess that we're in the world. And I think, I'm sorry, I'm just going to speak for a moment because I'm hoping that I'm being heard. I'm just very struck by what I see as a real difference in paradigm between what I would characterize as the nomothetic mindset and an ideographic mindset. And to me, that's all the difference between modern culture and indigenous culture and indigenous wisdom. Because my experience of indigenous groups is that they live with what is. They don't live out of a measuring and comparing themselves to other groups. They don't do this whole act of studying and comparing and contrasting and measuring, but they live in direct relationship to nature and what life is presenting, and they then respond to that. And I've, right from the start with Prosocial, I can see so many admirable aspects of it, and I can, with each of the design principles, I can say yes, 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 and yet at some other level, saying this isn't necessarily the best model for living what we're living in collapsed circumstances, where maybe there isn't a one best model. Maybe the only model is the one that I am living right now with the group I'm living with, having to respond to the challenges that I have to respond to. So I hope I've said enough. And I'm sorry I haven't heard you. I'm sure there's something really valuable in the process of what's going on. But that's where I'm coming from. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Mitty. I have closed your video because hopefully you'll hear me again. Maybe you can let me know in the chat if you're able to hear me now that we've closed the shared window. One thing I would say is Prosocial is not a model. So if you think of it as a single model, you're misunderstanding it. It's actually the convergence of many different kinds of research and patterns that are coherent across them. So I just want to name that piece so we don't think that we use Prosocial or we don't. It's actually that Prosocial is a description and explanation of many models and many practices, and it's deeply congruent across them. Another thing I want to say is that I would say exactly the opposite of what you're saying, which is that indigenous cultures live the way that you described because they co-evolved with their changing landscapes very slowly across multiple generations. And they didn't need to design their way through to survival. Or those that basically, for example, their adaptive behaviors might accumulate over several hundred years. We're in a time where in the span of 20 to 30 years, 50 years, and 100 years, we have to very intentionally and mindfully create changes during absolutely dramatic, unprecedented periods of change. The disruption is unprecedented in human history. And the ability to intentionally create these groups, to understand how the patterns work, and to work with them skillfully is going to be necessary for survival, and that indigenous groups did not have to do this. So I would actually argue exactly the opposite of what you're saying, that then rather than slowly accumulating cultural adaptations over hundreds or thousands of years, which is a beautiful way that human evolution works, that we have to actually very intentionally guide ourselves for survival of our species to create prosocial groups that survive the stress, conflict, violence, and turbulence of the coming couple of decades. And so I would strongly say against what you said for that reason, because of the context we're in. Now, that said, what's really important is that Prosocial is not a model. So if we say, oh, Well, how can a group have a shared purpose? There might be 500 different techniques for how you create those. And so it's not that prosocial is one or the other, it's the understanding of what is required for the group to find its shared, that for the group to function, it needs to have a shared purpose. It's a descriptive aspect of any effective group. And another thing I just want to say quickly is that the research is drawn from many cross-cultural settings. Eleanor Ostrom's work, for example, was done on all continents aside from Antarctica and was done in many different cultural settings. It wasn't simply the weird bias of Western educated rich democratic societies. I just want to name this because this is so important. And being prosocial and knowing how to be in a group that is able to cooperate and function well is essential. And knowing how to create those groups when most of us don't have the experience of them, it's also essential to have ways to learn it. And so this is something that I just wanted to really emphasize because it's so important. And that said, multi-worldview and multi-perspective is also essential. And I really appreciate where you're coming from and making the point that you're making. I'm also seeing that we're using quite a bit of the time that we have, which is fine. This is a very important topic. But I'd love to have the opportunity to maybe cover 2 more questions since we're getting to be at time, but I have the opportunity to explore a little bit further. And I see there's a question here that Jay asked that's gotten a lot of votes. And so Jay has asked, how can we design or influence the collective scaffolding in a movement of movements context? Thinking specifically about avoiding polarization or tribalism, echo chamber type separation dynamics, and so on. Hey, Jay, how's it going?
Good, how you doing?
Doing good. It seems like the last question sort of opens itself to whether your question is even an appropriate question, which is to say, should we be designing for change, and what kinds of knowledge should we use to design that change? And I want to hold the sensitivity to that as we talk about this, and ask you to just share more of what you were thinking here, and then let's just give it some context for flowing into the community Zoom calls for us to continue this more deeply.
Sure. So one thought that comes up that is maybe parallel to this is the sort of mainstream startup business, or start a community, start an audience, speak to your niche, go very specific, which seems to be a very effective formula for building an audience or launching a product or a service, but is also built on the back of separation, and that you are together because you're not what the other ones are. And I both resonate a lot with the example you presented in the exercise to figure out the behavior we want to model, and using negative examples as like a really powerful way to reveal what a group wants to be like. But I'm now thinking about that in the context, the cultural context we're in, where it feels like separation is just growing and growing, and that you can have people from many different pockets have a similar frustration that leads them to a certain place, and then they'll never speak. And if the way that those groups are organized are not somehow open to making bridges to other groups, it seems like a huge collective weakness. So it's kind of on that perspective.
I'm hearing you, and I'm just going, yeah, oh yeah, I hear you. I want to give a local example here in Barichara. Because we have these nacimientos, or birthplaces of water, well springs where the water comes out of the ground. And what happens typically here is anyone who can physically access the land, legally or illegally by crossing someone else's land, can put a hose in the wellspring and take the water. And so what happens is all the water is drained. It's classic Garrett Hardin tragedy of the commons. And so there's this conflict between people around survival-based issues like access to water. What's interesting is that the way to address that kind of a problem is to get people who have a history of not cooperating to start cooperating with each other. And here in Colombia, there's a long history of violence. So a lot of people learned to keep their heads down so they didn't get killed by the paramilitaries or the narco traffickers or the national government, because they were all killing the citizens for 50 years. And people learn to just be quiet and not proactively engage with each other as a way of surviving. And so there are going to be examples like this around the world that are really difficult. What I just described, just in very brief terms, is like, wow, that's a messy, complicated thing. And so what we need to know is that it's important to get people to start talking who haven't been talking. It's important to have weaving of healing, healing relationships between people that have broken relationships, like neighbors that don't talk to each other, and other kinds of things like this. And so this is part of thinking about this as regeneration. That regeneration is the autopoiesis of the social dynamic. The relationships act as a living system. And so what I think that marketing for the product does is it uses the algal bloom, or the virus spreading in a population sort of models, which are models that lead to collapse of the health and vitality of that ecosystem. They're basically grabbing as much as they can, as quickly as they can, while trying to beat someone else who's trying to do the same game. And what we're trying to do is create resilience, tapestries of resilience. And so it's just a different way of engaging and a different way of thinking about relationships. And most of it's about transformational healing, about bringing people into dialogues that are constructive after histories of being destructive, or at least debilitating in the way they interact with each other. Wondering how that resonates for you and just what's coming up, because I know you think a lot about these things.
Yeah, I love those examples. I think what I'm thinking about now is kind of like a related nuance to the question, which is like the evolvability of a shared purpose, and just recognizing that we're all kind of, still on a journey. And if we stamp it in stone from day one, maybe things are different in a few years and people are still experiencing things. So kind of the fabric of cohesion and how a group can be designed, or that there can be principles present that allow for that natural flexibility of like ongoing exploration. And maybe there's something there that relates to the humility and accessibility for other groups, as a way to not to avoid, as much as we anchor good regenerative values, there's the presence of this vacuous culture that is kind of filling the space. So it seems like if it's not proactively addressed, it will have significant influence. So I'm thinking kind of in that defensive terms, I guess.
Yeah, no, beautiful observation. So thank you. Thank you for asking the question, and thank you for sharing. I'm looking forward to how we discuss this in the next couple of days.
Sounds good.
Right. Thanks, Jay. Beautiful stuff. I'm wanting to be mindful about time, but I also want to address, let's see here, what other questions are in here? Maybe I have time for just one more. There's a question that Claire has asked, and Claire, for some reason, I don't have the ability to invite you on the screen, but I also see a few people have left, so I don't know if Claire has left. But Claire's question was, where did I jump up to that? There it is. Claire's question was, with the massive amount of propaganda, media manipulation, surveillance capitalism, yeah, Claire, I don't know why it's not giving you the opportunity to join. It's like the button to invite you isn't here. So sorry about that. But I'll just respond to this one quickly and then we can roll. It says, with all these massive propaganda and media manipulation and surveillance capitalism, it can be difficult to even properly see our context the way it is. There could be all kinds of cognitive dissonance. Can you speak to how we reframe our context so that it breaks out of the shackles of the mainstream messaging? The role of the arts in helping us to see and imagine. Ooh, that's a good question. I would say the role of the arts is fundamental here. And one way that we can do this is to think of something like Adbusters, or the work of artist collectives like Banksy, where people who know how media manipulation are done use the same techniques to deconstruct the media manipulation and show how it's done, or to do what's called frame breaking, which also is done a lot in street theater, where people will break the frames of social contexts to create different insights and experiences. I would say that this is really critical. And one area that this is related to is indigenous medicine practices and the use of things like mushrooms for hospicing and trauma, PTSD, the use of ayahuasca and the connection to plant medicine. is another domain I would add to this conversation, just to say there's a lot here. And I'm only adding one piece. I'm sure we can add more. But what I think is really powerful, and Pamela just mentioned it in the chat, is to have community processes where people create and deconstruct meaning together. And if there are processes to do that, that you'll have more media literacy and more capacity. And Julian's mentioning satire cartoons. I would say humor is really helpful because it lets us deal with taboo topics. And something I learned a long time ago is the topic you can't criticize is usually the topic that's most powerful at controlling people through fear. So the breaking of taboos in the sense of things we're not supposed to talk about is really important as well. And I just want to name these as some of the elements to say, I would love for us in the community calls this week to explore some of this. In these toxic information environments, how do we create prosocial groups? And out of those prosocial groups, discern with intelligence what to do so that it'll actually work. I think these kinds of questions and the relationship of the arts and creative practices to them are really important. So I'd love to have more conversations about that. And with that said, I just want to be mindful of time and say, sorry for the other questions that didn't get answered, but I want to respect our time. And just to say, really looking forward to the community calls this week. And I'm hoping that today's session was educational and insightful, has stirred things in for you, stirred things inside of you to think about and explore further. And I'm looking forward to talking about all of them tomorrow and the next day and onward from there. So thank you all so much for being here today. And yeah, let's practice being in effective groups and practice being prosocial and see how it goes. Thank you, everyone, and I'll see you soon on the other calls.